Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever pattern we're trying to be different. On my show today, I have a wonderful, superb, excellent guest. And this gentleman, I have to say, 3 or 4 years ago, beginning of Straight Talk, one of my early guests, Darcy Winslow, who I admire immensely, mentioned this gentleman's name. And I was like, this is a cool name because the first name is so cool because I am an artist. And it's just the first name. You had me at the first name. And then once again, another guest mentioned his name and another and another. And so finally, I have the brilliant Art Kleiner on my show. Art, welcome to Straight Talk with Af.
Thank you, Af. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
I am where you are in terms of just the interest in how, let's say, machine learning and human learning and organizational learning all fit together. So,
Yeah, right. Listen, you're a scholar. You have written so many books. You've advised so many business leaders, and you've also been in the information business as a leader. Being an editor of strategy and business in the old days. I remember. I think it's called something else these days. Strategy and I think, and if I've got that right, I'm not sure. And you've written this book, The AI Dilemma, which I haven't finished the book, but I'm reading. I sort of like reading chapters. I have to admit to all of my guests, they're all authors, so they'll shoot me if I lie. So I do read the books, but I go to chapters. So I look at a chapter, I read the chapter. I usually go to the end first if there's a conclusion because I want to know what this book is about, and then I go back and forth. That's my reading style. And I tend to read along with YouTube videos, articles you write, because then I get to the personality of the
right.
author, and that's the my learning style, right or wrong. And so I did a bit of that with your book, and I have to say, apart from your skills and your ability to write, your timing's impeccable, right? Your timing's excellent. That's always a
Well,
good thing. As a founder that screwed up a lot, I can tell you, timing is quite important in anything in life. And you know, you have touched on such important aspects of the AI world, the decisions that we're all trying to make at different sort of in different sort of zones and dimensions of our lives. You talk about this concept of four logics of power. I'll come to all of this much later. So for my guests, we're going to talk about the book in a minute. Just wait. Don't like come off the show. Just hang tight. But what is more important is you, because I've heard about you a lot, and I don't know enough about Art Kleiner, the early years. What's the story here in terms of your childhood, your family, and how you got here? That is really important for us on Straight Talk, and for me personally, selfishly, I need to understand the person before I go and see their triumphs and their work. So, is it okay if we start with your journey? Whenever you want it, wherever when you were a little wee lad, as they say, to now, and then we'll go into the book, if I may.
not at all. I was a New York suburban kid, and one big difference between me and a lot of other suburban kids is that I only had one sibling, and he was my younger brother, who was autistic. Beyond Asperger's on the spectrum. And so I grew up knowing that there was a large difference between people, and the kind of attuned to the ways in which people were affected by those around them and how they grew up. And I went to college, majored in English, knew pretty quickly that I wanted to write from a very early age, and discovered that writing about people really required knowing people, knowing
Yeah,
how they think and how they tick.
yeah.
So I was in San Francisco at the time, and I went to journalism school. I went to Berkeley, got a journalism degree, and started working for a publication Af you may or may not have heard of. It was the Whole Earth Catalog. Stuart
Okay,
Brand
okay.
founded.
Not haven't
Um,
heard of that one. I am in my mid 40s. I may look younger, but I maybe missed that one. But please go ahead.
well, Steve Jobs called it the internet before there was an internet. It
Right.
was a prominent book, and in the early days of the personal computer revolution, the days of Apple developing the Macintosh,
Sure.
Whole Earth, what got very interested in computers. I oversaw their computer coverage, and I got sick of writing about computers. And I, moved back to New York. I started writing about management. I realized that behind every tech story, there's a business story.
Sure.
Behind every business story, there's a culture story. And so I began writing about the culture of business. And I ultimately um, started writing about management culture and wrote a book called The Age of Heretics, which is, at the time, I thought of it as a history of the counterculture inside corporations. The idea that corporations don't just exist to make money. They also exist to make a better world. But where was the movement behind that actually turned out to be a philosophical movement going back to Mary Parker Follett and the turn of the century, but primarily to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s with Kurt Lewin, Eric Trist, National Training Laboratories. These are kind of seminal. When you put a flip chart up on a wall, if you still do that in meetings, that goes back, that was discovered in the 1950s when they needed to write down their ideas about where thinkers could go in business, and they didn't have any paper large enough, so they ran out to a butcher shop and got pieces of butcher paper, tacked them up on the wall, and then everything is moved on from there.
Yeah.
So I wrote that book and published it and began teaching scenarios and working with scenarios of the future, and just started doing a lot of work around what is an organization, how do organizations evolve, what's the source of power in organizations. The three great lies of the modern corporation are the customer comes first. Employees are our greatest asset, and we exist to return investment to shareholders. If you actually look at what people are doing when they walk around the company and are deciding what they're going to do next, it's, what does Joe think of this? How does this fit with Sally's plan? And I don't want to be the one to walk into Frank's office and tell him it's not going to happen. And
Yeah, gosh, bloody hell. Yeah.
so once you see that, you realize, organizations are operating on behalf of some core group of people that everybody thinks are important. And they think their job is to guess what that core group of people want and give it to them without asking. And once you see that, you start to see that a lot of society works that way as well. There are always people who don't work that way and who either rise to the top through just their gifts and their credibility and then get into the core group, or they get sort of tossed out because they don't fit. But a society that works like that was pretty much primed for technologies like AI when they came along, because we were not making our decisions. We're not making our decisions through what you might call pure the logic of the far-flung case. We're making our decisions for other reasons. And that's not a bad thing. That's just the way human beings operate.
Right.
But it makes the relationship between the tech and the person, the leader and the team and the organization, and then the AI that creates new functions with it, makes all of that really interesting and different than we expect.
So can I go back just for a moment because you you piqued my interest. When you think about human psychology, are you talking about the human condition and where you that point around the three lies, and actually it's about those everyday experiences and emotions that are driving our behaviors. And that, I guess, let me ask you the question. Why is that the case? Why is it that?
Why is that? Why do people make decisions that way, or why are
Why
things?
the example you gave of what did Sally think, and does that fit into this? I don't want to be the guy going into my boss's office to tell him that this is wrong. What did you figure out as being the primary drivers? And is it consistent? Like, has it changed from your
Well,
research then?
have you worked for a large company?
Yes, that's why I'm shaking, I'm nodding my head.
Okay, and I have too. I edited strategy and business. I was a managing director at PwC, and before that, it was part of Booz and Company, and then Booz Allen Hamilton. So I know the world of consulting pretty well. And in any large organization, there's really four types of structures that all interweave. Okay, there's the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
I report to you. I've got people at my level, people at the next level. And there's a kind of a golden mean of really good hierarchies. Like there can be great hierarchies. When you're in them, you feel I belong. I'm
Sure.
at my level. But the thing about the hierarchy is information that travels up and down the hierarchy is always very constrained. It's just numbers and comparisons because it has to scale. And, my story and your story don't really scale.
Hmm.
But if it was just that, the organization couldn't function because that's not enough information to function. So then you have the network, right? Which is basically who talks to who and what do we talk about? And that's where the knowledge of the organization travels.
Right.
Oh, you want to know how to actually get something through procurement? Well, you got to talk to so and so. That's an example of knowledge traveling through a network. Or, we use this slang, we use Python for this reason, and but we use this version of it, or here are the vendors we trust, and here are the vendors we don't trust, whatever it may be.
Mm.
And there's reasons for it, and lore and knowledge. And, this is our, here's our, the materials we work with. That's like really, I can tell you just so much because the rest of it is under, non-disclosure or trade secret.
Yeah.
That's all knowledge that travels through networks. And it is possible. There are people like Rob Cross and Karen Stevenson who have mapped networks and then discovered that organizations work really powerfully when the networks map a certain way. So that's the second way.
Got it.
Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point was all about that.
Mm.
Then there's the workflow. And, how does a project get from, a concept to investment to materials and labor? And, when are the deliverables and how do you make sure the deliverables are going to get there and you're meeting all the needs to be on deadline and how does all that happen? It is actually very similar to the market mechanism.
Mm.
So it's almost like the workflow is the market mechanism within an organization. And a really open organization is basically taking its workflow and moving it out into the market. And there are rules and
Right.
practices and best practices. And so that's a whole third thing. And then the thing I'm talking about, so we've got hierarchy, network, market, and then clan. And I'm talking about the clan consciousness. A lot of organizations, they have a father or a mother
Hmm.
who is the CEO. And then they have a lot of people who are in that, like sort of senior executive, but they're treated as, sort of revered uncles and aunts and cousins, or maybe they're not so revered,
Right.
but they all have the kinds of influence that people in a family have, where we're carrying little mental models of them around in our heads. And we're communicating all the time with that mental model in our head rather than the actual person. We're constantly guessing what the person wants. So in any given moment, you've got numbers coming at you through the hierarchy and
Hmm.
direct hands. You've got information, knowledge coming at you through the network. You've got the flow of work where you have deadlines and practices and obligations to meet and deliverables. And then you've got this like sense of, here's how we do things around here and here's who's important.
Hmm.
You, the employee, are juggling all those four things. And if you're a leader, and the leaders that I know are get really, some of them are really adept at this, and some of them focus on one or two. If you're a leader, people are looking to you as the living symbol of how to deal with these four dimensions.
And I love it. I love it. I'm thinking about my time in the corporate.
Yeah.
What happens when you've figured some of it out? So let's call them the people who get it. They've found a way to flex to a little bit like the old school hi-fi systems, which don't exist now. People listen to
Right.
music in these little pods. I just can't believe it as a musician. But remember, we had the equalizers. Like
Yeah,
you could actually control your sound at home.
that's
Through
good.
your hi-fi system, right? It was amazing. So as an architect, I'm an experienced operator. I can flex those four as I need
Right.
to based on business situations. Um, how does one how do in your experience what percentage of the population, or how many folks, or what type of personality do you believe has the ability to do that, to really, we used to call them corporate politicians. They just like totally get it. They're close to the CEO. They've been here for 25 years, whatever it may be. What's your experience in how they're able to figure this out and sustain themselves?
It's almost like there's a bestiary of corporate types. So there is the corporate, the person who knows how to go up the ladder and, as you say, is friends or in the core group. Basically, the core group are the people that everybody thinks is important for whatever reason.
Right.
Some, the CEO is probably in the core group unless he's or she is obviously on their way out. The there's probably some gatekeepers, the person who runs the critical factory and nothing can get made without their approval is
Yeah.
in the core group.
Yeah.
And then there are people who are just known for being wise, and they're in the core group too, because nobody wants to walk into their office and say, we're not going to make our numbers this quarter.
Right. 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 But tell me
So
about it. Yeah.
so there's and then obviously the chairman of the board or chairperson of the board and some, but not all of the board members, and sometimes members of the core group are dead. I'm sure in some level, Steve Jobs is still in the core group at Apple. Nobody wants to walk into their idea of him and say it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Probably less now than 15 years ago, but 10
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah. That's incredible.
So the the way in which you rise internally is you follow a path and you become attuned to that path. And the path is different for every company, and you learn what the path is and you follow it. And in the process, you lose touch with what life is like outside the company. But there are a lot of people who get that facility with knowing, so they pick up on the four dimensions that I've talked about.
Right.
They become pretty proficient at the market, the workflow. They're really good at the networking. They know how to get knowledge back and forth. They may not be that great at the hierarchy, and they may not be, and so they don't necessarily rise. And those are the people that look around and say, I could do that. I could be my own company,
Mm.
have my own core group. And I
Mm.
think a lot of people start companies because they want to be in the core group. I think that's the motivation for entrepreneurs
Yeah.
of various sorts.
Yeah. It's very, very, very interesting because so I've got to make a segue into your book, and this is a nice way. So let's go back to what you just said a second ago. You talked about the outside and the inside. Okay. And then how there could be these sort of invisible walls that are sort of built in the company where you're so focused on, the four blocks, essentially, or hierarchy, all the way down to the clan. That's what you're immersed in. You're like buried in it. I remember this. I remember being, I wouldn't say a victim, but I being a recipient or participating in that process.
Right,
Speaking about it in a diplomatic way. And then things happen outside of your company,
right.
disruptions, creative
Yeah,
disruption, technological shifts that are black swans, bright swans, as you call them, and many, many other things. And if you're awake and you're listening and you're alert, you'll pick it up. But it appears that many people aren't. And of course, history is the best predictor of the future to some extent, because we can see a long casualty of companies that died, whether it's that blockbuster moment or even now with generative AI and classic AI, which of course we're now going to move into. So this force is coming. Well, it's here. It's here. It's not coming. It's here. And it's like a tsunami, if you want to call it that, or something a bit nicer. And global corporations are still trying to figure out what the hell this is all about. And I have to say, so a real example, I was in Davos a few weeks ago, my first Davos trip, and what an interesting trip that was. And the way I would describe this the company I used to work for is in the technology research space called Gartner, who I'm sure you all know. And Gartner, for example, is a technology agenda setting company, let's just say, okay, for argument's sake. A Davos World Economic Forum event is a world agenda setting event, okay, from a perception standpoint. Loads of CEOs turn up, government leaders turn up, and so
Yeah.
on, and they talk about stuff. This time around, like I said earlier on before we started the show, we had the likes of Sam Altman and all these other very interesting, powerful people talking about generative AI. And that was like the core theme, aside from, net zero and the other things. Generative AI, generative AI, generative AI. And of course, all the CEOs who turned up, many of them, will now go back to their CIOs, the chief information officers, and say, hey, what the heck's going on? Why aren't we spending more money on this? And of course, there's a bit of groupthink going on at this point. So the AI dilemma as a concept, first, I'd love you to describe it and why you wrote the book, is perfectly positioned right now because, for example, at that point, when I was in Davos, we heard Sam Altman talk about his generous, very generous, charitable idea, which was where he has no equity in this new venture of his, AI Box. And of course, everyone can own, it's a fractional ownership model. So even poor people can have a stab at it if you can figure out whether, to source $150.
This is AI bucks. Is that what you?
Box, BOX. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
AI Box. So this is Sam Altman's announcement at Davos to say, listen, we're going to build the world's largest marketplace of AI modules and tools, and everyone can have access to it, and it's going to be great. And this is the next generation of what really should happen. And every new product that's developed, which could be $1 billion business, of course, will be feeding off this marketplace, because it's for everyone. We want everyone to be wealthy and successful and solve problems of the world. And he will have no equity in it, but he wants everyone else to be rich. That's fine conceptually. Of course, the problem with all of that is monopoly, monopoly, monopoly. And already with AI, and you're the expert here, I see as a technology founder that it's already owned. The custodians and creators are already just a few companies. They own this thing. And we're all sort of waiting here saying, well, okay, cool, I'll develop something. I'll do something with diversity, equity, inclusion, build an AI engine. I'll use, agnostic AI modules and build some sort of an LLM or whatever it may be. But the ownership feels a bit one-sided. As the example narrated, as I just shared, this idea of how certain people in certain organizations seem to be, monopolizing AI to a large extent, brings us to this point where there are many dilemmas. There are many things to think about depending on who you are in this global ecosystem. So I hand over the baton to you now. This is your space, I guess. So tell us about the book, why you wrote it. You've co-authored it, of course, with another brilliant author. And then perhaps you could address a little bit of my question, and then we can go into flow.
So my co-author, Juliet Powell, she and I have both been in the scenario and future space. We were introduced to each other by Napier Collins, who is a well-known scenario thinker and futurist, recently passed away. And Juliet had been working for several years on research on AI, responsible AI. Essentially, when a tech company is saying we're capable of regulating ourselves, what does that mean? What's the actuality in practice? And as you know, the track record is not great. It's pretty dismal. Inherent biases that were not well known until researchers like Dr. Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru found them and publicized them. Lack of concern about data. We just saw that with the breach of that bank in Hong Kong, where through essentially phishing using AI as the ferret of personal data information. Lots and lots of risks in terms of misidentification of people and, misinformation, and now this deepfake sort of perpetual scandal that it's hard to imagine what exactly the solution will be. And these are just the sort of first wave of activity. We don't know quite how these will be used to, actually target people and treat people poorly, especially vulnerable people.
Right.
And it's not in anybody's interest for that to happen. It's certainly not in society's interest, but it's not in a company's interest. And the reason why, so many companies, it turns out, follow the path of least resistance. Whoever has the most predatory behavior, they feel they have to compete with that. So they kind of move away from the responsible stance to the predatory stance. And Juliet had documented a lot of this and wrote a dissertation on it. And I read, she asked me to read it. I've done a lot of work with books and, written or edited or helped develop a lot of business books.
Mm.
And I said, "You've got a book here." And she asked me if I would be a co-author. So it was like an amazing opportunity. You mentioned the timing. This was, we started it in 2020 and 2022 actually, just, and we finished it within 6 months. We finished the first draft. So we
Wow.
were done. And then OpenAI released ChatGPT. So we had to rewrite the whole thing. And especially the last chapter, which you,
Right.
sort of started with. So, and then it was published in August. It's actually September of last year, this past September. So we set out to say, we didn't want to do an AI bashing book because it's a very powerful technology, indispensable technology, for things like medical research, most obviously, but also for solving problems, but also for allowing people the opportunity to manage creative tasks in a much more generalized, spread across a larger population. And it takes a lot of the cost of ordinary work out of the ordinary work. So in that
Yeah.
sense, it's a huge boon to productivity. We've already seen it and we've just seen the beginning of it. But productivity, when it is, any AI system reflects the attitudes, beliefs, and values and actions of the human and organizational system that put it together. And that's where the track record is not so great.
Hmm.
And that is the AI dilemma. In the wrong hands, it's awful. In the right hands, it's necessary, wonderful, and they're the same hands. How do we instill, technology has traditionally not been governable. We don't want bad governance. We want governance that is constructive. Innovation tends to route around whatever constraints are placed on it. And therefore, how can we have innovative, benevolent governance when, people are who they are?
Do you
That's the
think, sorry to interrupt, do you think, because you triggered this, do you think the people who are writing the regulations, the people who are creating the governance models and systems, do you think they are, I'm just going to say, do you think they're competent enough to deal with this tsunami, given it's changing? I mean, you're writing a book and you had ChatGPT launch, and then of course, being in the field myself, literally every week there is change. It's impossible to keep up with. Do you think a core group of governance specialists will cut it really this time around?
Well, that depends, doesn't it, on who they are and what they know and who they talk to, and especially what the processes are for raising these issues. There's the European AI Act, European Union AI Act is probably the most pertinent case right now. And they've had a lot of people commenting and raising questions like, okay, you say, so the AI Act breaks AI down into four categories.
Mhm.
Minimal risk, like games and spam filters. Um, Limited risk, which are, things like advice bots and, And they're okay as long as they're minimal risk unless they pretend to be human. You don't want a therapist acting like a human therapist when they're actually a bot, um, or a robocall or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, then it becomes the next category, which is high risk. So, that's a lot of things like self-driving cars and predictive analytics,
Mm.
really valuable, important things, but can be misused.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And those, for they're assigning auditors. So it's a little bit like saying, can the financial system be regulated? Aren't the regulators of the financial system, they're never going to be as well paid or as sharp as, the billionaires who are running the banks. What makes us think that they can regulate with any kind of credibility?
Mm. Mm.
Just going
Mm.
to be co-opted and captured. And to an extent, that's true. But also, it's an open system. And it's a system, banks were not wild when, the financial, they weren't tremendously happy when the financial audit controls, when, the gap regulations and the accounting regulations came in. But they had to accept them because we live in a shared system.
Right.
And then there's open debate among professionals, among skilled professionals all the time about what that means. And you have people on the left, like Elizabeth Warren, sort of coming in and saying, well, these are the issues here, and being very clear about it. And you have people on the right, or, or people very much in the industry saying, actually, there's a burden. And, the regulatory burden is overmuch if it,
Mm-hmm.
but for those who care, there's some accountability, because with transparency, there's always a kind of accountability. There's always a decision that gets made in a democratic system
Right.
that is supposed to be relatively fair. Well, honestly, tech is the same kind of thing. I might look at any member of parliament and say, that's really great what they said, or, that's like off the wall, and,
Mm.
they shouldn't be in that position. And I would have an opinion, but my opinion, again, is only worth what my background and experience is worth. And sooner or later, in the book, we call it creative friction, a process in which these qualitative judgments can also be used to make clear decisions.
Mm.
Julia and I have an offering which we call the calculus of intentional risk.
Okay.
And it is a way of taking decisions about AI and evaluating the potential risks, the risks of not doing it, including the financial risk. So for instance, if let's say it's a system of evaluating the creditworthiness of a person based on predictive analytics. I'm just making this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, so there's a risk right there that someone could get misidentified and then be able to sue. There's also a human risk that groups of people could be targeted as poor credit risks, and that could then become a backlash, and they, tarnish the company's reputation, but also actually tarnish the reality of the world with who knows what after effects and add-on effects. There is the risk of not doing it, because this could be a lucrative way of, managing that issue. It could also be a way of opening the door to better understanding of one's own credit situation, and more opportunities. It could be
Right.
a way of, so there could be benefits to society from it as well.
Yes.
Weighing all of that is situation specific. It partly depends on the capabilities of that firm. It partly depends on the capabilities the of the people being audited and credited, and the auditors, and it depends on the social dynamic. And ultimately, you can't do that through legislation. You need some kind of hands-on advisory, but also regulatory capacity. The auditor is a model that seems to work for that. Somebody who has standards, but also can judge a company based on, what it's actually doing and the circumstances. The auditor has to be independent, right?
Mm. Mm.
right now, the structure typically is that the auditor is paid by the company, but must follow strict rules of independence.
Right,
They can't be
right.
influenced. And that's probably the tech model as well. That seems to be the tech model that's emerging. So in that context, you also have pre-audit advisors who come
Mhm.
in that the company does pay to say, let us figure out how to do what we want to do while still not overseeing these boundaries. If you're going to say nobody's qualified except the company to oversee it and how it's going to deal with these boundaries, which is kind of what the self-regulation, only we know what we're
That's right.
doing.
That's right.
So only we are qualified. Well, then you're in a world where the rest of the world is more vulnerable than I think we want them to be. That's not the problem we're trying to solve here. The problem we're trying to solve is how do you get the best without having to trust that the purveyors will always be at their best?
Mm, mm,
Because, we have examples. Recently, huge examples in, the Bitcoin world,
right.
but also lots of examples in the AI world where it just didn't work out that way.
Yeah.
And as you said, I think, the pressures are so great on anyone in a company to meet the bottom line that it's very hard for anyone to speak out. And yet at the same time, if you don't speak out, you are not only are you not being accountable, not only, but you're turning your world and the larger world into a world that nobody, including you, wants to live in. Nobody really wants to live in a world of haves and have-nots, I
Mm,
think. Maybe
mm,
people do. Maybe people think I'll be such a have, I'll be insulated from everything else, but it doesn't always work out that way.
yeah. So with I think when you think about classic AI, which is what you were writing about in the book, and then you said generative AI just went nuts that November, I think in 2022, whenever it was, they launched
Mhm.
OpenAI launched GPT, and since then, of course, there's been so much more. Anthropic and all of the cloud companies have gone off. AWS has done Glue, although Google believed they'd do a much better job with Gemini, and then of course Microsoft put loads of cash into OpenAI to shore up their Gen AI strategy and so on. You talk about creative fiction, which I love, by the way, and I think I've heard you talk about the fact that the word creative friction is, of course, obvious. The word creative, at least for us as thinkers and doers, is about fun. It's not like a laborious, painstaking exercise. So creative friction is not just about like really, really serious problem-solving exercise. It can be perhaps enjoyable and feed your curiosity and all of those other things. Tell us a little bit more about, perhaps you can unpack this concept so people who are listening can connect with it more and maybe imbibe it and practice it by reading the book, of course, and watching your YouTube videos.
Certainly. And, I'll just say in passing, we knew Gen AI was coming,
Right.
just didn't know exactly when it would be released. And most of the tech companies were constraining themselves. They were not releasing
Yeah.
it. When OpenAI released ChatGPT, then everybody else said we have to catch up.
Right.
Creative friction is okay. So imagine that you work for a company. Let's imagine you founded a company. It's a startup and you are like 100 and you've got a product that is an amazing product. It's got some bugs and some features that are controversial and you want to, but it's gonna come out there. It's not unacceptable risk. Unacceptable risk are things that actually overtly target groups or misinformation generators and that kind of thing. It's acceptable risk, but you want to make the most of it, and you get obsessed,
Hmm.
and you're on a track. And anything that's a distraction is a distraction, and you push it aside, and you want the work to be as frictionless as possible. And if you're an e-commerce vendor or or you're working with developers, you want their experience to be as frictionless as possible. You want to eliminate friction. You
Right.
want a button that says, yes, I'll do it your way to be the big button that everybody presses. And all that fine print, you want it to scroll quickly off the screen and you want people to just be said. And, they're one of the most popular books on user experience design is called Don't Make Me Think. And not thinking becomes a goal and actually can become a lifelong goal. And I fell into this when I was working in the corporate world
Mm.
because there were just so many core group people and so many other things to manage. Don't make me think about anything else. I want to choose what I think about and delegate thinking about everything else.
Mhm.
And isn't that great? There are computer systems I can do it to.
Mhm.
Well, the problem is that organizing your life and your work that way leads to a kind of non-creative, non-friction where you you stop looking at the unintended consequences of what could happen and you look only at the things that fit with the way you want things to work out.
Mm.
And that leads to, disasters. Sometimes it leads to, unmitigated legal disasters and, Sam Bankman-Fried,
Mm.
for
Mm.
instance. Now, I don't know the circumstances up close, but, this could arguably be a case of somebody who just got caught up in frictionlessness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Easily done. What you describe, just to intervene for a moment, the case that you've painted, of course, you have experience in this, hence you've articulated it the way you have in terms of the story. Most founders, I have to say, most founders, at least of technology companies, and many CEOs would have done this, are doing it right now. And it's easily done because of the human condition, I think, and so sorry, I just want
no,
to,
it's great.
I endorse you for your live example. So that, I guess then what should we do differently and how do we do it differently?
You put practices in place to artificially, no, not artificially, you put practices in place to creatively have the kinds of conversations that lead you to transcend your own path of least resistance.
Mm.
So for instance, we use the example of X, Astro Teller's group at Google, and the conversations they have deliberately designed to make sure that there are alternative points of view and perspectives. We use other examples, the whole four logics of the book, the business perspective in which, the bottom line and making a profit is important. If you don't do that, you won't have the cash flow you need to keep going. The engineering perspective is important. You have to have the technological capability and you have to really know what the technology can do and can't do. And you have to keep pushing the boundaries of what it can do because that is where your gains come from.
Right.
The government logic, somebody has to be accountable to society as a whole. And then you have the social justice logic, which is, okay, society as a whole is great, but that too can be corrupted. That too can, operate for a few rather than for many. Who is looking out for the vulnerable and
Mm.
all of us? And especially for the ways in which we can be harmed without really realizing it.
Mm. Mm. So as a founder, as one builds a company, I think what you're saying is, and you call this the four logics of power, if I'm right, you're saying creative friction, extremely important, and realize that you are locked in that cage potentially, or you're on that treadmill. You're one of those guys saying, shit, I'm one of those guys. And then you're saying to recognize that these different stakeholders or people or constituencies, whatever they are, constituent groups, the engineers, the business leaders, the government, and the social justice, community, they have
Yeah,
their own drivers. They have their own motivations. And I guess when you're building a company, you have to understand. You have to understand. Maybe have conversations with these communities for a start, right?
very much. And you may have conversations within your company and then with outsiders. Your goal is to raise your capabilities
Yeah.
and now actually one of the really interesting aspects of Gen AI in particular is you can delegate a lot of the other work to automated systems.
Absolutely.
And you can also delegate a lot of the work of kind of making sense of these conversations and summarizing them and consolidating to automated systems. But the actual judgments, this is what we should do. This
Yeah.
is what we should not do. This is what we don't do. And this is how we get what we want and still don't have to do what we don't want to do.
You
We're
know, I
going to,
have, sorry.
that's creative friction.
Yeah, I just want to give you a live example. So the startup that I'm in right now, we're doing a lot of use of Gen AI, different models. And let me be clear, it's for processing. It's processing advantage and seismic benefits by processing at a rapid pace, okay? Trillions of data points or terabytes of data into this machine and using AI modules. Absolutely. What would take a person 30 days now takes them 3 hours. Right? We'll all be able to do it. It's sort of commoditized. What worries me, though, about AI, which is where I'd like your input, is the personalization aspects. And, I've heard a lot about this in education, like I had, who you will probably know, Nolan Bushnell
Yep.
of Atari fame, who's
Yep.
working with the Exodexa Manifesto, which is bringing gamification principles, and so on and so forth into physical and virtual school. Right, that's his big mission right now. He was on the show because he wrote this book called "Shaping the Future of Education," and I know you speak a lot about education. You've written books on it and so on. And we talk a lot about personalization. But I'll give you a really crude example because you've been in the digital media space as well. Personalization of news, for example. I'm going back to your creative friction analogy. The problem with personalization of news is if I'm in the creative friction, if I'm that person with the walls around me and I'm like, bang, focused, I will only select the topics that are conducive to the things that matter to me at that point. And what I'm getting fed through the app is everything that I need to see in this moment. And we are seeing, I don't want to discuss war or anything like that, but we do see this as part of misinformation, or even if it's accurate information, it's feeding, this bipartisan sort of partisan existence that we see in the world today. What is your view on? I find that AI to be damn scary. I got to be honest with you, right? That's the AI where I think, oh my god, I'm not going to be able to think freely anymore because it's being fed to me in so many different directions and highly curated for me in that zone that you describe. How am I going to come out of that zone if everything around me is forcing me to stay in that zone?
So, and personalization goes beyond that. I'm working on an article right now on how governments can misuse AI and what to expect. And it's tricky. It's tricky stuff because on some level, we don't mind it. Many of people don't mind it as long as it's happening to the other person, the other side. And but I think that a lot of people want to have the option of hearing more than their bubble tells them. I think we all see the amount at which we're like trapped in bubbles, and social media and now AI driven social media accentuates that.
Right.
And we don't, I don't even know if there's a preferences panel on something like TikTok or Reels where you can kind of say, so it's kind of like they get it from your, but as they say in the stock market, past behavior is no guarantee of future behavior.
Right.
And human behavior is especially true that way. And people crave that balance between novelty and familiarity. They crave an edge.
Mm.
And they will seek that edge, and they often do. And that is where, so if you're a pessimist about human nature, you will believe that that needs to be legislated somehow. We
Mhm.
need some kind of digital media fairness doctrine or something. And eventually we'll get there because we need it, or we won't get there and we'll suffer. If you're an optimist about human nature, you kind of believe that people become naturally more capable at dealing with this over time. They don't, that there is something innate about human nature that resists a bubble, an information bubble, or that resists a cult
Right.
of sort. And I tend to believe that's true. Um, and Juliet and I talked about this yesterday, actually. I found a scholarly paper that said that people, if you write something with ChatGPT and you write something, with a human, the human is written and they're on the same subject, um, they tested this and they found that people could tell which was which accurately about 50% of the time. This is a group in Germany, a research paper in Germany at a university there. But if they were familiar with ChatGPT, that number jumped to 80%. They could tell the difference. Now, on the other hand, there are people are trying this all the time. They're writing things and then having ChatGPT write it.
Hmm.
They're fooling, journalists, and they're fooling educated people. So
Hmm.
it's hard to know whether people become more sophisticated at spotting fakes as time goes on. At first, no, it's possible to be taken advantage of. If you don't have the capability, there are still, people falling for Nigerian scam artists.
Mm.
Um, the scary thing with, that this deep fake in Hong Kong raised and that other deep fakes have raised, Cory Doctorow just wrote a really good article about this, is that the the extent to which an AI can ferret out and put together facts that are unique to your situation and then use that to, target you. So for example, it's one thing if somebody calls up and says, I'm your dad and I'm in trouble, can you wire me,
Mm.
$5,000? It's
Mm.
another thing if that has your dad's voice. It's still another thing if the dad's voice bot knows certain facts about you that only your dad would know.
Right.
And we are already in a place where you're gonna, with anybody who's in that category, you're gonna keep like a secret handshake like password or bit of information that nobody could ever find out that you're
Mm.
going to ask if there's ever a problem like that. And that's going to be a standard type of preparation like writing a will.
Mm.
And things of that sort will evolve for people who are paying attention. Creative friction is another word for paying attention,
Mm.
but it's kind of like the joy of paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
No.
turns out that paying attention in a thoughtful and continuous way turns out to be a more joyful way to live. Unfortunately, many of us aren't finding out about it until later in life. And one of the interesting things, about apps and, personal finance apps, weight loss apps, um, exercise apps,
Mm.
living apps, meditation apps. These are all ways of prodding people who otherwise wouldn't pay attention to pay attention.
Right.
And gradually that becomes habitual. A lot of the self-help movement is basically people saying, I want to be forced to pay attention to what's good for me
Mm.
because I just don't want to take the trouble. And because I love frictionlessness,
Mm.
I'm probably a really good example of someone who would rather not pay attention at all to the thing, but I have to. So my consolation prize is that paying attention has its own rewards.
The beauty is the work that you do, as in the day job. As you're an author, you're a thinker, you're reflecting, you're writing these fantastic journals and books and articles and so on. So you're kind of in a way forced to come out of that zone, I guess, because that's what you do.
So a lot of these things are things I do because they are part of a larger picture. My day job, the ways in which I actually make a living.
Mm.
Some of them are related to that, but as you know, the market for writing can be tenuous.
Mm.
I teach at NYU, and that's part of it.
Mm.
I do a lot of work with consulting editing, editorial consultation. I do a lot of work with executive coaching and leadership development.
Mm.
And in many ways, the frontier of this is where I like to think I'm right at the heart of it, which is organizational behavior is changing. It's
Right.
going to change as a result of AI. AI behavior, machine behavior is changing. It's going to change as a result of what leaders do. And leadership behavior is changing, and it's changing because of the changing nature of organizations. And to help people, so a lot of our work, KPI's work, my work, the work of people I, know and respect, has to do with learning and framing those changes in ways that they're palatable and they can, change one habit at a time. I've been spending some time with the Marshall Goldsmith method of
Mm.
executive coaching.
Right. Yes.
And a lot of that is you say, I am a leader, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble in subtle ways, but if I don't address it now, I'm going to be in trouble in bigger ways later.
Mm.
So I need to find out what one or two behavior. I can't change myself all at once.
Mm.
First of all, I'm a leader. I'm not going to.
Mm.
I'm just too important and entrenched. But I can find out what the one or two things, one or two habits that I could change might be. Even that's going to be difficult. I can find out from the people who work with me what habits actually require changing, what they think I could do differently. And then I can resolve to change those and I can check in regularly, briefly and regularly with the people who work that way. So, in my work on AI and with teams, we bring that perspective. It's not about you have to change your whole worldview or give up your idea about regulators but if you're going to market regularly with programs that are backfiring and causing criticism, is there something you could, or if you're having difficulty retaining staff and they're moving to other
Yeah.
places, or
Yeah.
tech people and
Mm.
your OD and your HR people can't talk to each other and they don't know, or your marketing people and they don't know what each other is talking about.
Mm.
Are there one or two things you could be doing differently that would, you're in the core group, everybody is thinking, what do you want? What can I do for you?
Mm.
Without having to ask you, because I want
Mm.
to show up giving you what you want. Are there one or two things you could do directly that would break some of these bad patterns and actually allow you then to take real advantage of the technology?
Mm. Bang on. I can think of a few people who might need that help and support, actually. Um, I could talk to you for hours, and of course we have to because there's much to discuss. Aside from the book, I think we need to discuss AI tools. That's something I know you're passionate about. And of course, I'd like to probe a little bit more on leadership of the future, because I think leadership, you talked about change in those three areas. Leadership is going to change. Leaders, the type of leader we see in the future is going to be different, and so on. So I'd love to talk to you about more around that on the next show. Before you go, however, how has the last hour and a bit been? I know we had a little disruption in the middle, but just your feedback would be great so we could do better next time. And would love a few words from you.
You are a really good interviewer, and I can explain what that means specifically. You ask questions that start a conversation going. Your questions are direct and to the point and relevant and interesting. They're not the expected. And then you let the other person talk. And you have really good body language so that by watching you, I can tell when I'm kind of getting a little boring or when I'm meandering a bit. And you know, I'm trying to keep from meandering. I'm trying to stay on point. So you are, as an interviewer myself, I try to have that quality. I try to ask short questions. I try to have it. And then the other part is, but you actually engage. You have things to say. So you're not intrusive, but so most of what I mean, everything I have to say about you as an interviewer is positive. If you wanted, I'd really have to think about it to sort of say, this is what I wish you'd do differently. I thought you did great.
I'll take the positive stuff all day long. I'll take it all day long, especially from Art Kleiner. This is totally going down in one of my testimonials. But hey, on a serious note,
Actually, you could use it. That's fine.
I will absolutely, if that's okay. I don't want to infringe any IP. But listen, what a pleasure, and you're brilliant. You're just a brilliant guy. I love the way you're so calm and collected, and of course, that's years and years of wisdom, experience, and you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot, and I'm hungry. By the way, just before I go, the demographic last year of my guests was kind of a little on the older side. So
Yeah.
one of my younger viewers like, "Hey man, how come you've got like these senior people on the show?" I said, "Look, man, I want to learn from them because they've got way more experience than you and I put together and others, and they've made many more mistakes." And so, it's what a pleasure it is to have you on the show. Keep writing. I'd love to bring you back again, so we'll organize all of that. And you're a hero. So thank you very much, sir. Look after yourself. And Straight Talk viewers, Straight Talkers, click on the subscribe button. We'll be back with Art, in the next few weeks, months. And be well. May the force be with you. Art, take care.